Hey everybody, Douglas Blair Roberts here, the Super Vader 400 here. It's time for another video, and this time, as you can see by the title above, this is Doug's this is Doug's worst comic book based movies list. This is a video I've been trying to do for a long time, but I've been trying to get together a good list of worst comic book films. These are the worst comic book films I've seen. And by the way, in order to qualify for Doug's worst list, it doesn't matter how popular you are, how much money you made at the box office. It's quality, spirit, essence of the comic books, and just how much these films piss me off. Piss me off is why each film is on this list. Each film is on this list for a specific reason, and I don't do nostalgia either. So, um, certain films that have stayed off of my worst comic book list in the past that I grew up with, pretty much the film I'm talking about is Batman and Robin. I'm not going to tell you where, but it's definitely on the list. And like I said, going back to popularity, films like The Dark Knight, films like the Dark Knight series is on the list, but I'm not going to tell you where and tell you why, because I want you to watch the entire video and find out why. But yeah, these are Doug's worst comic book based movies. There will be a lot of controversial films, a lot of controversial choices for this list. But like I said, it's not about popularity or box office. It's about quality, quantity, spirit, essence of the comic books, and how much these films piss me off and how do they fare as movies. So, with that being said, let's get started right now. It doesn't matter what you think. Here we go. Oh, you can't. Hey everyone, it's time for part two of Doug's worst superhero and comic book based films. And to start off this list, we're going to start off with the original live action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles films from the late 80s and early 90s. These films are at the bottom of the list because they're not as bad as the other 9 films on this list, but they're pretty bad and they're highly overrated, especially the first film. The second 2 films, in my opinion, are much better than the first film, but all 3 of these films, especially the first one, are overrated. Are overrated. These films, while capturing the spirit of their comic book and cartoon predecessors, predecessors, these films are campy, dated, and just overrated. The sto- the storyline and directing is good, but the screenplay is atrocious. The action sequences are atrocious. The actors and stunts people in the suits, they can barely move in the costumes, and the entire plot that started with the source material, the comic books, is just incredibly stupid to begin with. And then the biggest reason to hate these films are its fans who overrate these movies and think that they're such cool people and such badasses because they like a certain era of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and think they're better than fans think think they're better than fans who like modern interpretations of the Ninja Turtles, such as the 2012 series and of course the Michael Bay produced based Ninja Turtles movies, which I think both of those are way better than this live action trilogy here. And they like to act like these movies were some of the greatest of all time. When these movies came out, these movies got a mixed to a negative reception on the Rotten Tomato meter. Only hardcore fans and 90s and 80s purists loved these movies so that's why the Ninja Turtles films are number one, and I will be talking more about why these films are terrible in a future rant on these films. But yeah, that was the original. That was the Turtles films. The next film on this list is X-Men First Class. Now, this film is okay. It's not as bad as it was. It's not as bad as some of the other films here, and I don't hate it as much as I did back in 2011 when it came out. But this film right here is still one of the worst comic book movies of all time. One of the most overrated too, because this film, despite the flaws, was hugely popular back when it was released in 2011. And some people are waking up, but some people to this day still consider this one of the best X-Men films of all time. When this X-Men film, not only did it butcher the source material, but it also butchered and screwed up the entire X-Men storyline, because the whole purpose of this film was to focus on characters like Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, Beast, and many more who didn't get to be seen much in the original X-Men trilogy. That was the purpose of all of these origin-based movies. They were gonna better flesh out the characters before they moved forward with X4, which they should just move forward with X4. Yeah, X3 didn't come out the way you like it, didn't get the critical reception you wanted, but you still knowingly made that. And instead, they chose, in my opinion, to take the easy way out and reboot. Sometimes reboots have to be done, but in my opinion, especially in cases like this was an example of taking the easy way out of a problem. You knowingly created X-Men 3 and Wolverine Origins. Both of those films still happen. So to make a film that erases those films and to make a film that ignores both of those films is just a false advertising, because you didn't tell us you were going to do that. False advertising, and B, it's just taking the easy way out and not admitting your problems. A common problem I have with 20th Century Fox, and one of the main reasons I'm glad the X-Men franchise is back in the hands of Marvel, where it belongs, since Disney has recently acquired 20th Century Fox. But X-Men First Class is terrible. X-Men First Class, the comic book, is based on features the original lineup of X-Men led by Professor X, Cyclops, Jean Grey, um, Beast. They can't use Iceman because Iceman was in the original trilogy and was a kid in the original trilogy, so he can't be in the 60s or 70s. Um, 70s and many more characters like Angel, but um X Men. That's the comic books. The movies, it featured a younger Magneto and Professor X, but the movie had a different team made of Professor X, Magneto, Mystique, two characters who would never be caught dead, being X Men. They've teamed up with the X Men to deal with a greater threat, but they will never be caught being X Men. Havoc, who's only part of the X Men briefly, and a bunch of other characters who don't appear in the X Men comic books for like multiple issues. And the entire plot was just stupid. But like I said, it's number 9 here because this film, like Wolverine Origins, was a Magneto and Professor X film, which they did talk about, a film focusing on the early days of Professor X and Magneto. Now, in my opinion, a Professor X and Magneto film was not really necessary because I felt the original trilogy fleshed out the fleshed out and developed those characters the best. Those were the two best characters in the original X-Men trilogy, in the original X-Men trilogy. But I remember when this movie came out in 2011, I remember hating this film. I was angry with the critical reception this film got. You had the casual goers who didn't know any better. Then you have the comic book fans who supposed to know better went to this movie and tried to, in order to defend the film when they knew it sucked, tried to defend it by saying it followed the comics when it clearly did it. Then you got the other people who don't read comics, just watch these movies, and all of a sudden get caught up in the hype and think these movies are good. And now, several years later, people are starting to wake up and see just how terrible this film was. But why couldn't you do that back in why couldn't you do that back in what was it 2011 when it happened? I was so mad this made more money than Green Lantern 2011, which I was surprised to see that I enjoyed that much better than I enjoyed this film. But I'll be talking more about the problems with X-Men First Class in a future rant. Next is X-Men Days of Future Past. This was much better than First Class, but the middle part was boring. The beginning and ending were great, but the middle was boring. Not to mention, just like the last one, this butchered the source material. Instead of Kitty Pryde, Shadowcat, going back in the past to prevent the Sentinels from being made and exterminating the mutants in the future. In the future, no, we have, once again, we whore out Wolverine. We have him go back to the past. The combatant. We have a film where he doesn't do much fighting, doesn't do really any fighting for almost the entire film. We have him go back to the past to talk to a young Professor Xavier, and the middle part of this film was boring. The first and ending were what we wanted, a sequel to X-Men 4, what I wanted, a sequel to X-Men 4 with the X-Men and mutants banding together to fight the mutants. That was what the beginning and end of the film was, but the middle part was absolutely terrible, and they should have used Shadowcat. If you don't want to use Shadowcat, the animated cartoon did this much better, where they had time traveling movie time traveling mutant Bishop, who was in this movie right here and got wasted in this film. Have him go back to the past, and the cartoon did even better with using the Days of Future Past storyline and combining it with another storyline where one of the X-Men and mutants was a traitor who assassinated John F. Kennedy. But the X-Men Days of Future Past. This was one of the bigger films of 2014, and it's still a pretty good comic book movie, despite being a horrible, lackluster, terrible adaptation of X-Men, in my opinion. Number 7 is X-Men Apocalypse. I love this movie right here, but this movie was just absolutely terrible. Apocalypse, his plan made really made really no sense. There were lots of plot holes in this film. There were major pacing issues. The first hour of this the entire second hour of this film is absolutely boring. The young cast members portraying the younger versions of Cyclops and Jean Grey, these two were the worst. Cyclops and Jean Grey were absolutely terrible. They were so bland, boring, and lacked personality. The the cast from the previous X-Men movies, X-Men's 1 through 3 and Wolverine Origins. That cast was older but much more charismatic in comparison to this cast right here. In Apocalypse, it was great to see him here. But like I said, his motivation and everything was stupid, and he was a joke. And a lot of people compared him to Ivan Ooze from Power Rangers, and Ivan Ooze from Power Rangers was a much better villain. Um, but what I liked about this film and why it is number 7 on this list is they made this film more X-Men like than the previous ones did. This film, while still butchering the source material, this film was more like the '80s lineup of X-Men, and they made a film with Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, Archangel, Archangel as and Nightcrawler and Jubilee as main characters. You even got a cameo from a young Striker and Wolverine as the Weapon X. And then the final climatic battle. So yeah, this film, like I said, was a cross between the '80s lineup of X-Men and the 2000s X-Men Evolution cartoon series, because two of Apocalypse's four horsemen in that cartoon were Storm and Magneto, and Archangel is one of Apocalypse's four horsemen. He took regular Angel Warrington and made him more powerful by recreating him as recreating him as Archangel. So I like that in the film. And Cyclops was awesome in this film too. So yeah, that's why this film is down low on my worst comic books list. But yeah, this right here, this wasn't a good film, but I still liked it and enjoyed it. Number 5 is Deadpool 1 and 2. Deadpool 1 was one of the biggest disappointments I had in 2016. The film was so terrible, cringeworthy, and unfunny. Deadpool's girlfriend, who's a mutant in the comic books, similar to Mystique, was incredibly useless in the film. They took characters like Angel Dust, who were heroic characters in the comic books, and made them bad guys. And and yeah, the only thing that was really good about the film was the action, when there was action, and Colossus, Colossus and Mega Teenage Sonic Warhead. Um, yeah, and the villain, even though the villain didn't look like himself. But I just thought the film was absolutely terrible. But they still captured the spirit of Deadpool, which is why it's number 6 on this list. The sequel was much better, bringing Cable into the franchise, and I like how Josh Brolin was Thanos in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and in this universe was Cable, and Cable came in this film talking about how terrible Deadpool was. I also like the inclusion of X Force, who are horribly wasted, and the inclusion of Juggernaut, who was the main antagonist of this movie right here. So um yeah, two overrated, bland, unfunny, cringe-worthy comic book based movies, and Ryan Reynolds has to be one of my worst portrayals of a superhero. But at least he acts like he looks and acts like his character. But the comic books and even the various cartoon appearances of Deadpool are way more entertaining. Before we continue with the top 5 worst comic book movies, we're gonna do honorable mentions. And the very first one, as you can see by the picture here, is Power Rangers 2017. A pretty good film, but I thought this was a lackluster Power Rangers based movie. It was way too serious, way too dark and brooding, and also had terrible pacing issues. The final battle was lit though, and was worth the price of admission with the Megazords, the Power Ranger action, and the remix Power Ranger movie theme playing in the background. All the Power Rangers, in my opinion, were terrible with the exception of Billy, but the actors still captured the personality of the Power Rangers. It's just in my opinion, if you wanted to make a super serious Power Rangers film, you should have done one of the modern seasons like Lost Galaxy, In Space, uh, Time Force, and SPD. But if you were gonna do the Mighty Morphin era, that should have been lighter and much more campy. Campy. If you want to do a serious comic book film, you should have left Power Rangers alone, in my opinion, especially the season you were adapting. But yeah, Next is Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens, one of the biggest disappointments I had of 2016. 16 film was film. I don't remember much from the film. The production was great, the cast was great, the action was good, but the cliches and blatantly stealing and playing it safe by rehashing material from the sequel, from the original trilogy and the killing off of Han Solo, which I'm still mad at Harrison Ford for. Rogue One. This was actually a pretty awesome Star Wars film, but it was highly unnecessary. Who needed to watch? Who needed a film about the construction of the Death Star? About the construction of the Death Star. Did you really need a film based on that? No, you didn't. The Dark Knight trilogy. Dark Knight trilogy. Don't hate it as much as I did several years ago, especially after watching a certain film which will be named later in this a certain film series that will be named later in this video right here. But these films, especially The Dark Knight, are highly overrated. I thought The Dark Knight Rises was the best, followed by Begins, with The Dark Knight being the absolute worst. The Dark Knight, in my opinion, was poorly written, was brilliantly directed, but was poorly written and just highly overrated. And I hated what this film series did to the comic book industry. While rejuvenating interest in Batman on film, this film series right here kind of killed comic book movies for a while. Every comic book movie that came out had to be like this. Had to be super real. Had to be super realistic, and people wanted things that have no business being portrayed as real. Portrayed as real. People wanted these people wanted the Nolan direct everything. I was so happy the Avengers came and knocked this out of the park. Nobody wants to see this super realistic um dog piss anymore. They want a comic book film with they want a shared comic book universe with characters teaming up and coming together for one giant film like Avengers. So happy Avengers knocked this out of the park and got DC back on the right track. Next is one of my all-time favorite films, Batman and Robin. I still like this film, but in comparison to all the films that came before it and all the comic book films that came after, like the X-Men series and the MCU and the DCEU of today, yeah, this film hasn't aged well. Biggest problem with this film is first off the costume design, mainly for Batman and Freeze. Freeze's costume is okay, but that thing on his head, that helmet, just looks incredibly stupid. It makes him like a pinhead and an idiot. And and Batman. I like the Batman Forever and Tim Burton costume better. The one he had here, in my opinion, was just terrible. Robin had the best costume in the film. It was probably one of the MVPs of this movie right here. But I thought this film, that despite the studio, another problem was the studio constantly forcing Schumacher to make a kid-friendly Batman film. I thought that despite all the hassle and all the demands from the studio, I still thought they still made a decent to okay comic book movie, but it's absolutely terrible. Then, oh yeah, they really screwed up Bane, the worst character in the film. The live action adaptation of everyone else was actually pretty good, but Bane was the absolute worst. You could have just took a normal henchman and just say it was another character. Why did he have to be Bane? Because it wasn't Bane from the comic books. But in my opinion, they've never done Bane justice outside of the comic books. Next is the hugely popular Avengers Endgame. So many plot holes, feminist SJW garbage that I talked about in my rant. Next is Justice League 2017, an awesome film, but bland, forgettable, bland and pretty much forgettable and incomplete. It didn't have all of its characters and didn't feel like the complete Justice League, but a pretty entertaining film. It's just forgettable. Once you've seen it, you'll forget everything you watched in this movie, and it was one of the biggest disappointments of 2017 when it should have been the biggest film of 2017. Next, Super Dragon Ball Super Brawly, the best and worst comic book and anime film of all time. Awesome because Brawly is now canon in the franchise, but it's absolutely terrible. Terrible video game cartoonish animation. Probably one of the worst animated films of all time. horrible artwork in several scenes, in animation in several scenes, including one comical scene where Vegeta and Goku were practicing the fusion dance. The animation artwork was absolutely atrocious in that scene, and just various other plot holes in the film that I talk about in my second review and rant on this film. Next is Battle of Gods. Not bad, but not that good either. A ripoff of Marvel's Champions of the Universe, and a horrid and Frieza being a main character in this arc. Frieza being a main character and a main topic of discussion in the post Cell and Boo sagas, and being forced to take that seriously. Transformers 1 and 2. 1 was good back in 2007. Actually, it's still good. It was the best back in 2007, but it's just okay by today's standards, especially in comparison to all the movies and other Transformers films that came afterwards. 2 gave us more of what we wanted from the first film, but 2 still had too many human storylines, too much crude humor, and that ruined the film. That ruined the film and forever ruined and tainted the Transformers and Michael Bay's legacy. No matter how good Michael Bay makes Transformers, which he's been doing since 3, um, people will always look at this film. People and critics will always look at this film because of how terrible it was. The gang bots, and all of the crude humor, which ruined the plot of which just totally ruined the film and made it look bad. They will always look at these two movies, especially the second one right here, RoboCop 2. Um, RoboCop 2, one of the most overrated films of all time. The first film was good, but it's highly overrated. It was the best back in '87, but it's just okay today. I'm one of the rare people who likes RoboCop 3 and the reboot much better than the original RoboCop films. But this film right here, 2, it was entertaining, but it was absolutely atrocious. I'm one of the people who complain about the villains, especially having a little kid as a supervillain in the film. I did not like that right there and thought it was incredibly stupid. Don't get why people like this over the third one. I enjoy the third one much better than I enjoy this one. The Wolverine 2013, one of the most blandest, boringest, and most forgettable films of all time. The film is okay at best, but it's boring, bland, and forgettable, and they massively screwed up Silver Samurai. Not to mention, this has never been a problem in X-Men films, but there was really no blood. There was really no blood in any of the fight scenes, and that ruined this movie right here. Just made it look fake and subpar. Net last but not least on the honorable mentions list is Infinity War. Infinity War um Infinity War is the biggest box office spectacle of 2018. It's also one of the most overrated and poorly written films of 2018. Love the action story, characters, and the large cast of actors but I did not like the screenplay in this film. Lots of characters did dumb things, as I talk about in my Infinity War reviews and rants. Now it's time for the top 5 worst comic book films, and number 5 is Fantastic Four 2015. This should have been higher up on the list, but I decided to put it right here. 2015, one of the biggest disappointments of 2015. When this film was announced, I thought it was going to be terrible. However, my opinions changed when I saw the trailers, which the trailers were real good. When I saw the film, the entire film was terrible. The last 30 minutes of this film was real good. If the entire film had been like the last 30 minutes, this would have been a much better received film. There was way too much science in a comic book movie. Yes, science fiction was a big part of Fantastic Four, but that wasn't the only thing. There was action, there was adventure, there was comedy, there was space adventure, time travel, a bunch of other cool comic book elements, and none of that was here. Then the time travel stuff was stupid. Somehow Reed Richards, by hooking a bunch of N64 together, created a parallel universe. How does that happen? What kind of science is that? But yeah, the original 3 Fantastic Four films. That's the B movie from the '90s, and the 2000s films were way better than this. And this film makes those like Oscar-worthy material. Number 4, Black Panther. I did not enjoy Black Panther. I did not enjoy Black Panther. I thought it was one of the worst films of 2000. One of the worst and most overrated films of 2018. What I hate about this film, they butchered Claw and T'Challa and Killmonger absolutely sucked in these movies. The actor T'Challa was way better in the Avengers and Civil War film, but this film he was terrible. One of the only highlights from this film was the beautiful Wakandan women, the character Shuri and Okiai and Makabu. They were much better. Makabu was a much better fit for Black Panther than Chadwick Boseman. I think that's his name, the guy portraying T'Challa. But yeah, and the females had better fight scenes than the men. But yeah, and T'Challa and Killmonger has some of the worst costume design ever, and they had one of the worst CGI fights I've ever seen. Yeah. Number three, Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel. Um, Captain Marvel was Captain Marvel was one of the worst and most overrated films of 2019. I had high expectations for this film. I've been excited for Captain Marvel since 2014. When I heard about this, I couldn't wait to see Marvel on the screen. And when it comes to Captain Marvel, I only knew about Marvel. I didn't learn about Carol Danvers until I saw a death battle with her and Android 18 from Dragon Ball Z, and then I did research on this character, and I was excited to hear that it from the trailers made it seem like Jude Law will be portraying Captain Marvel, and he will be Carol Danvers' mentor. He was Carol Danvers' mentor, but he wasn't Marvel. He was the villain, Young Raw. He was the villain, Young Raw. First off, that's false advertising. They made it seem like Jude Law would be the hero in the film, but he was the villain. Then the actual Captain Marvel, first off, they made her a she. Then they killed off the character so Carol Danvers can be the face of Captain Marvel and can be the face of the Marvel Cinematic Universe on forward after Endgame. And right there, doing those two things just ruined this film. This film is actually okay. It's not bad, but it's not really good either. But doing that just totally ruins this film and makes this film one of the worst films of all time. And I can't stand Brie Larson. So yeah, I'll talk more about Captain Marvel in a rant on that movie. Number two, you should have known this film was gonna be on this list. This film series, the Amazing Spider-Man film series, both one and two. Both of these movies are terrible, with two being the absolute worst. One is almost as bad as two, except one is just as bad as two, except one only has one plot, whereas Spider-Man 2 had two plots, had multiple plots that didn't go together or connect or weren't really resolved. But this film series butchered so many characters. We had a terrible, unlikable lead in Andrew Garfield, one of the worst actors, one of the worst superhero actors of all time, and the worst Spider-Man of all time. I like Toby and Holland better. I like Toby and Holland and Garfield, Mark Webb, and entire Sony people. They screwed up this film, and not only did they have the audacity to make these two films, which butchered eyes, the source material, messed up characters like Rhino, Electro, the Goblin, the Harry Osborn and Peter Parker relationship, but one of the worst things that they did, they had the audacity to not only announce two sequels, but um they also they also announced they also announced two they also did, announced spin-offs like Black Cat, Spider Woman, and Venom, and a Sinister Six spinoff when you couldn't even get the regular stuff right. Focus on your first film. They were too busy trying to set up other movies, and also ripped off popular franchises like Batman Begins, Twilight, Batman '89, the Star Trek series, the Star Trek Into Darkness movie, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so much more. Just tried to cash in on stuff that was already popular instead of giving us what we wanted, an accurate portrayal of the accurate and real portrayal of Spider-Man, and improving on what the problems the Sam Raimi films did. This film was everything that was terrible about the Sam Raimi trilogy and none of the good stuff. Everything that was terrible. There was so much wrong with both of these movies, and I consider them to be the worst live action comic book movies of all time. There are probably worse films, but this is 2014. Films like Steel, Batman and Robin, um, um, Electro, we've come so far that a film now should be much better than those films right there. Um, so, um, so this is the worst comic book film of all time because this was a blockbuster and had the potential to be even more, be bigger than what it was. And this was the biggest corporate cash in and grab on a franchise. I'm so happy that it failed because I actually thought this was going to be extremely popular. If this was popular, it would have killed the entire genre. Not only Spider-Man on screen, but the entire comic book genre. And we did not need another terrible film. First Class, the Nolan trilogy, First Class, the Nolan trilogy, and yeah, those were bad enough, and we did not need another one out there. So yeah, the worst comic book movie of all time. You should have known this was gonna be on this list. You see the picture here: Dragon Ball Z, Fakatsu no F, Rise of F, whatever you want to call it, Resurrection Frieza. This is the worst comic book movie of all time. Of colossal waste of time, of animation, everything. The storyline. That's the storyline. First off, Frieza coming back to life, Frieza obtaining a power source, Frieza tapping into a power source that was more powerful than the Super Saiyan, the Ascended Super Saiyan, Full Power Super Saiyan, Ultra Super Saiyan 2, Mystic, and Fusion, the greatest powers in Dragon Ball. It can go toe to toe with the Super Saiyan Red and Blue. Red, and Blue, and got killed off in a nonsensical way after blowing up the earth and killing everyone. He got killed off in a nonsensical way with Goku, with Wiz rewinding time, and Goku killing Frieza with a Kamehameha wave, sending Frieza back to hell. There was so many plot holes in the film. They nerfed characters like Piccolo and Gohan. Piccolo and Gohan just made both of them look terrible. Both of these guys couldn't kill struggled to kill weak Frieza soldiers, and Gohan could barely turn could barely maintain his mystic power and could barely turn Super Saiyan, and got owned by Frieza in 2 hits. The same Gohan that beat Cell and toyed with Majin Buu couldn't beat Frieza. It was one of the worst animated and anime films I have seen of all time, and this totally killed Dragon Ball Z for me. So Dragon Ball Z Fakatsu no F is the worst comic book film of all time. The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 are the worst live action comic book films of all time. All of these films had the potential to be great. All these films had the potential to be great, but were just wasted. And Fakatsu no F is also number one because all the other films on this list, that's studios screwing up the source material. This is the same writer. This is Dragon Ball's own writer screwing up their entire source material. Fakatsu no F, the like I said, the worst comic book film of all time. It makes all the other films on this list seem good in comparison. So with that being said, I am done. This was the worst comic book films of all time. It's time to hit my music. Turn off now if you don't want to hear the rest of the music.